Okay, so we're going to be talking about the difference between independent and dependent variables. So if you think about what those words mean in real life, it's going to be similar for math. So the dependent variable depends on or is influenced by the independent variable. And you can kind of think about this like you and the adult that you live with or the adults that you live with. So about your parents or whoever, you are called a dependent when they file their taxes. And that's because you are dependent on them for certain things like food and a place to live and clothes to wear. So you are dependent. Hopefully when you grow up, you will be independent. You will not be dependent on somebody else. So a lot of times this is shown on a graph. It can also be shown in a table. But your y-axis is always going to have the dependent variable on it. And your x-axis is always going to have the independent variable on it. And the way that I like to remember this is that you can take the y-axis and it can become a capital letter D for dependent. So I'm just going to, I probably have a better marker for this, but I'll just use this one. Here it is. I'm going to make this a capital D, D for dependent, and then the x-axis can become a part of a capital I for independent. Honestly, that's how I remember myself. Another way is there's this acronym, dry mix. Each letter stands for something, and so it stands for dependent runs on y-axis, mark independent on x-axis. Dependent runs on y-axis, mark independent on x-axis. I prefer this because to me it's just easier to draw the D and the I. But if dry mix helps you to remember, that also will work. And these are situations that we see a lot of times in the real world. There are certain things that depend on other things. So remember, your dependent depends on your independent. So something that's dependent on something else is your test grade. It's dependent on a lot of things, but we're just going to talk about one thing. One thing that your test grade is dependent on is how much you study. The more you study, the better you should do on your test. And again, there are other things that are going to affect that, how much you slept, if you stayed on task during class, that kind of thing. Another thing that is dependent is your electricity bill. Hopefully, you don't have to pay an electricity bill for a while. But the electricity bill depends on a lot of things. And in Texas, especially during the summer, that depends on how much AC you use. If you like to crank the AC down and have it nice and ice cold in your house, you're going to pay more on your electric bill. When you get a job, if it's hourly, your paycheck is going to depend on some things. And one of those things is how many hours you work. If you work more hours, and I just wrote that in the wrong color, but pretend that's blue. If you work more hours, you're going to have a higher paycheck. And if you work less hours, you're going to have a lower paycheck. You'll notice that all of these things that are on the left, all of the independent variables, they have to happen first. You study and then you take the test and get a grade. You use the AC and then you get an electric bill. You work the hours and then you get a paycheck. So the independent always happens first. So the dependent depends on whatever happens. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is how far you can drive. So if I were to get in my car right now, I could drive and drive and drive, but I can't drive forever because eventually I would run out of gas. So how far I can drive depends on the amount of gas in the tank. If I have a full tank, I can go pretty far. But if I'm almost on empty, I'm not going to get very far when I'm driving. So those are some situations that it would be considered independent and dependent variables. And just remember, the big thing for this is dependent is on the y-axis, independent is on the x-axis. Okay, hope that helps.